What we found in the new John F. Kennedy's files. The John F. Kennedy story still resonates, albeit more faintly than it once did. Kennedy was a popular liberal president who, at the time of his death, was challenging the country to embrace civil rights and a strategy for peace to end the Cold War. Kennedy was shot dead as his open-air motorcade passed through downtown Dallas on a sunny day in November 1963. America's most enduring murder mystery. Declassified records to clarify the CIA's response to John F. Kennedy's murder. After Kennedy was killed, the Dallas Police Department immediately picked up an ex-Marine named Lee Harvey Oswald and claimed he shot the president. Oswald denied the charge and was killed in police custody the next day. A year later, a commission of Washington insiders concluded Oswald acted alone and unaided. JFK's death was not politically motivated, it was proclaimed. President Joe Biden authorized the release of the documents, but will continue to block some materials from public view until June 30, 2023, claiming releasing them now would result in identifiable harm. The Biden administration declassified a trove of documents related to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. While this action brings the government closer to the full disclosure of relevant files mandated by a 1992 law, it kept the most sensitive records secret during the period. That changed in 1992 after Congress passed the JFK Records Act. And all of a sudden, all these government records that had been secret for a long time, were coming into the National Archives for the first time starting in 1993 and 1994. The release of thousands of records relating to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy hasn't settled the best-known, real-life whodunit in American history. But the record offered riveting details of the way intelligence services operated at the time and are striving to keep some particulars a secret even now. Congress unanimously approved that JFK Records Act, which is actually a very strong law. And it was strong because it took the power, the final power of declassification, out of the hands of the agencies and gave it to this independent review board. And that's really began to get the true record of the assassination. The assassination of President John F. Kennedy on November 22, 1963 spawned numerous conspiracy theories. These theories allege the involvement of the CIA, the Mafia, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson, Cuban Prime Minister Fidel Castro, the KGB, or some combination of these individuals and entities. To clarify the question, the Warren Commission, 1963 to 1964, found that Lee Harvey Oswald assassinated President Kennedy and they found no evidence of a conspiracy, either foreign or domestic. Did the CIA have a hand in the murder of John F. Kennedy, an American president? And here's the answer is yes. Believe they were involved. It's a whole different country from what people thought it was. It's all fake. It's hard to imagine a more jarring response than that. Again, this is not a conspiracy theorist. Not even close. CIA was involved in the assassination of the president. The CIA has long claimed that it had no contact with Lee Harvey Oswald before President Kennedy's assassination. And for nearly as long, the public has just not believed them. Over the years, voluminous evidence has emerged that shows Oswald very much on the CIA's radar, and new documents released cast even more doubt on the agency's unbelievable claim. Still, there were, at least, a few new nuggets in the files that were just declassified and going to go over a few of them with author Jefferson Morley, who runs the Substack JFK Facts and is the author of numerous books on the characters in the JFK story, including Scorpion's Dance, The President, The Spymaster, and Watergate, which is about Richard Nixon and CIA Director Richard Helms, and The Ghost, The Secret Life of CIA Spymaster James Jesus Angleton, and Our Man in Mexico, Winston Scott and the Hidden History of the CIA. Jefferson Morley, author and editor of the JFK Facts. Jefferson Morley started reading about the JFK assassination in the 1980s. He was interested in how the assassination story was refracted into the culture in movies and books. The pre-assassination Oswald file was not entirely declassified until 2001, when one of the signatories on the records died, John Whitten. So it took 38 years to declassify the CIA's file on the alleged lone assassin, indicating the sensitivity of who he was. And the idea that he wasn't of interest to the CIA is a cover story. Disclassified documents were a trove. And so, in there, found in the CIA's pre-assassination Oswald file, the names of CIA officers who had signed off on a piece of paper about the unknown Lee Harvey Oswald while JFK was still alive. Declassified records and interviews demonstrate that the agency settled on the story of a lone gunman in order to conceal its deep pre-assassination interest in Oswald from law enforcement, Congress, and the American people. The pre-assassination Oswald file, this collection of the 42 documents that the CIA had in their possession at the time before the assassination, the records about Oswald. CIA was running a COINTELPRO-style operation against the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, a leftist group that was opposed to U.S. policy in Cuba, and pretty popular and pretty effective. They could put people on the street for a protest demonstration, they could get people to write letters to the editor, they could get people to go to Cuba in the summer and say what they saw. And that was a real obstacle to U.S. policymakers. And the CIA and the FBI had targeted the Fair Play for Cuba Committee for destruction. There was an operation against the Fair Play for Cuba Committee that involved Oswald, and that some CIA officials knowingly used Oswald for intelligence purposes before the assassination. But right now, the CIA is determined to control that narrative by controlling the basic facts. George de Mohrenschildt was a geologist who traveled all over the world looking for oil, basically, and tipping off oil companies about that. He was a bit of a bon vivant, a white Russian born in Minsk, and he was living in Dallas in 1962 when Lee Oswald returned. And de Mohrenschildt said that he asked a friend, Jim Moore, who was the head of the CIA office in Dallas. And so de Mohrenschildt befriended him because de Mohrenschildt had grown up in Minsk, and so he became friends with Oswald and he liked Oswald, and they met often in late 1962 and early 1963. And de Mohrenschildt is interesting because he was probably the person closest to Oswald who testified to the Warren Commission. And his testimony was very damning to Oswald. De Mohrenschildt came to regret that and, 10 years later, he concluded that his friend Oswald had not killed the president. And he wrote a memoir explaining why. And he said that he believed Oswald was what he said he was, which was a patsy. So de Mohrenschildt was an interesting character in Oswald's life, and de Mohrenschildt also, as part of his job, cooperated with the CIA. He wasn't a paid agent. But he knew when he was talking to CIA people, and he gave them information, and they gave him information. So he does turn up in CIA files quite apart from his involvement in the Kennedy assassination story. Oswald visited Soviet Union as a true believer in socialism and communism. He lived there for a couple years and became very disillusioned. It was very rigid, conformist, tightly controlled. It had none of the openness of American life. He was being watched by the KGB constantly. And so he got tired of it, and he came back. And until April 1963, Oswald had no visible connection or interest in the Cuba issue. And when he goes to New Orleans, he starts writing to the Fair Play for Cuba Committee in New York. But not until August 1963. When he comes out publicly as a Castro supporter, it is entirely because of his encounters with a CIA-sponsored propaganda group called the Cuban Student Directorate, Directorio Revolucionario Estudiantil, a leading militant, anti-Castro group at the time, which was funded by the CIA, under a program called AMSPEL. So after 30 days of his contacts with AMSPEL, Oswald now has a full-blown reputation as a Castro supporter, including TV footage, radio, and newspaper headlines. All of that material that was developed as a result of Oswald's encounters with the AMSPEL program, all of that is fed to the press within hours of Kennedy's assassination. Kennedy was killed by a communist, a supporter of Castro, a shocking revelation. Now that they drove the first day coverage, people look at all the headlines the next day: the pro-Castro marksman, the pro-Cuban assassin. About pre-assassination Oswald file, people at the top of the CIA knew all about this guy. That led to kind of the COINTELPRO side of it. COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program, COINTELPRO sought to undermine and destroy civil rights and anti-war organizations from 1958 to 1974, the CIA's interest in the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. And the fact that this question of Oswald and the Cubans, over time, that's the last thing that the CIA surrenders in any given context. And so they lie to the Warren Commission, and they say, "We didn't know Oswald was in the Cuban consulate in Mexico City until after the assassination." Is that a CIA plot to kill the president? Remember, the CIA is a junior agency in 1963. It's only 16 years old. The center of power in the American defense and intelligence establishment is the Joint Chiefs of Staff. They have the prestige and the money. We may see an operation against Oswald that was controlled by the Pentagon, not by the CIA. Operation in New Orleans, which was run on the ground by a guy named George Joanides out of the Miami station. Joanides was no rogue. He was doing exactly what somebody above him wanted. Bill Harvey, who was the head of the CIA assassination program, is a possibility. James Angleton, chief of counterintelligence, who also ran operations and black operations as a candidate, and could be somebody in the military. The redacted Joanides files illuminated two previously unknown aspects of the John F. Kennedy story. The first was Joanides' role in an authorized and deniable CIA psychological warfare operation that generated propaganda about Oswald. A job evaluation from 1963 revealed Joanides ran a CIA-funded anti-Castro student group, the Cuban Student Directorate, known by the code name AMSPEL. Within 48 hours of Kennedy's death, Joanides' agents published the first JFK conspiracy theory, claiming Oswald and Cuban leader Fidel Castro were the presumed assassins. The second story revealed that Joanides' obstruction of a congressional investigation. In 1978, after the Watergate-era revelations about CIA abuses, Congress reopened the JFK probe by creating the House Select Committee on Assassination. The agency called Joanides out of retirement to serve as liaison with the committee investigators. He shut down their inquiries. Even under direct questioning, he did not disclose the Oswald AMSPEL activity. A 1979 job evaluation praised Joanides as the perfect man for dealing with the committee. In 1981 he received the agency's Career Intelligence Medal for exceptional achievement. Declassified files point that they do not contain evidence that Joanides plotted against JFK's life. They contain plenty of evidence that he abetted those who did, after Kennedy was dead. He wasn't in Dallas when JFK was killed. He helped run the cover-up in Miami and Langley afterwards. He died in March 1990. We were used. Two astute contemporaries, Fidel Castro and Charles de Gaulle, also believed that Kennedy fell victim to a conspiracy emanating from within U.S. security forces. Castro was a battle-hardened Marxist revolutionary. De Gaulle was a continental conservative snob. They knew, as well as anyone, the workings of American power and the machinations of the CIA. More recently, Rolf Moat Larsen, a retired CIA station chief and just security editor, told a conclave of retired spies that he believes if the CIA were responsible for JFK's murder, it was likely certain rogue CIA officers in Miami. CIA produced documentary evidence consistent with the Castro de Gaulle Moat Larsen interpretation of November 22, 1963. The Joanides files laid bare agency operations around Oswald. Joanides' propaganda agents among anti-Castro Cuban students created a plausible public record, in intelligence parlance, legend, that Oswald was a leader of a pro-Castro group called Fair Play for Cuba Committee, FPCC, in New Orleans. The FPCC was a popular socialist organization with 30 chapters on college campuses that defended Castro's revolution, which had abolished racial segregation and redistributed land to poor people. The CIA operation that monitored and manipulated Oswald emerged from a joint CIA-FBI program known as COINTELPRO. Short for Counterintelligence Program, COINTELPRO sought to undermine and destroy civil rights and anti-war organizations from 1958 to 1974. According to this declassified memo, the CIA was conducting a secret operation against the FPCC as of mid-September 1963. Joe Nides was involved. Within hours of Oswald's arrest, his AMSPEL agents in the Cuban Student Directorate fed reporters the story that the president had been killed by a leader of the FPCC. One of those AMSPEL agents was Jose Antonio Lanuza. A retired school teacher in Miami, Lanuza served as spokesman for the CIA-funded Cuban Student Directorate in 1963. According to a JFK library memo, the Cuban students received $51,000 a month from the CIA. On the night of November 22, 1963, Lanuza recalls the group communicated with the group's CIA handler, Joe Nides, whom he knew as Howard. Lanuza also recalls speaking with a dozen local and national reporters about the connection of Kennedy's accused killer to the pro-Castro FPCC. The next day, the AMSPEL information fueled headlines that the American president had been killed by a pro-Castro assassin. "We were used by the people who wanted to make Oswald take all the blame for killing Kennedy," Lanuza said in an interview. "We were ideal cover for using the theme of Oswald being a Castro supporter. Somebody wanted to build up that story. That's where we came in." The first-day AMSPEL publicity blitz did much to convince the public that a liberal president had been killed by a communist. But was it true? Under interrogation, Oswald denied shooting Kennedy. He told reporters that he was a patsy. The next day he was shot dead in police custody by a Dallas nightclub owner with organized crime connections. These shocking and baffling events gave birth to 1,000 conspiracy theories. Inside the agency, one might say that Joe Nides protected the agency's sources and methods around the Oswald AMSPEL FPCC operation. Outside the agency, you could say he was honored, at least in part, for perpetuating the JFK cover-up. House Select Committee on Assassination General Counsel G. Robert Blakey, now emeritus professor at Notre Dame Law School, told PBS Frontline that Joe Nides had obstructed Congress's investigation, a felony. Was he concealing the existence of a CIA operation to falsely blame Oswald for killing JFK? Or just CIA incompetence? Absent full disclosure, definitive conclusions are elusive. CIA fell short of getting the whole story. The agency identified but never released 330 Joe Nides files. These include 44 documents from 1963 and 1978, which concern Joe Nides' cover and intelligence methods. They are key to the JFK story. They identify the senior agency officers who authorized psychological warfare operations that linked Oswald to Castro's Cuba before and after JFK was killed. The assassination of U.S. President John F. Kennedy was the most notorious political murder of the 20th century. Kennedy was the fourth U.S. president to have been assassinated while in office, after Abraham Lincoln, James A. Garfield, and William McKinley. Almost from the beginning, the killing of the popular young president was thought to have been the result of a conspiracy rather than the act of an individual, despite findings to the contrary by the Warren Commission. The assassination and its aftermath played out through the newly dominant mass medium of television, which made it a uniquely immediate and shocking experience for many Americans. Kennedy's death also brought an abrupt end to his supporters' sense of optimism about the country's future, which had been fueled by his broad popularity. The answers are a long time coming.